Washington, D.C. is my home away from home. I've worked here for the better part of 3 decades as a founder entrepreneur, policy expert, and author.
Probably the longest title. Everybody sort of shortened it to ONC for sanity's sake.
Mercifully.
Yeah, mercifully.
I've learned leadership secrets from many healthcare executives who understand that Washington is the largest payer and regulator of healthcare.
She said, well, because you'll never get a husband if you do that.
I began interviewing healthcare leaders many years ago because what better way to learn how they think, why they make it to the top, and how they remained there. Think about what was your most challenging engagement.
Healthcare has been the most difficult problem, I think. Let me just say.
We'll talk about that later. Jeff Immelt was CEO of GE for 16 years, a position he describes as the hot seat, which is the title of his new book. During Jeff's first week on the job, the terrorist attacks of 9/11 occurred, followed 7 years later by the Great Recession. How did Jeff react to the crisis of 9/11 and the Great Recession? Ultimately, he assessed the magnitude of economic change, and he set in motion a restructuring plan that would alter GE's revenue and earnings profile. You can hear in his voice that changing the financial trajectory of one of the oldest companies in America was painful. Through all the change, Jeff maintained a positive outlook, and you'll be able to understand why as he explains. Those of us in healthcare know of Jeff from his 4 years as CEO of GE Healthcare. Jeff shares with us what lessons he learned about healthcare during his time there. He was committed to learning, and he discussed his rationale for expanding the Crotonville teaching facility and curriculum. We wrapped up this very candid and enjoyable interview by asking Jeff his advice for up-and-coming leaders. Well, good morning, Jeff, and welcome.
Hey, thanks, Gary. It's good to see you again.
We're pleased to have you at the microphone for sure.
I see you there in the Capitol. Are you going to get yourself in trouble down there, or what are you up to?
I'm not running for office, and I'm not raising money, Jeff. So
Good.
I'm sure during your time at GE Healthcare, you spent a fair amount of time here, probably your whole career at GE, you spent time here, right?
Yeah, it's one of the big, changes over time, Gary. I remember in the late 90s, Jack used to say to us, any time in Washington is time wasted. Nothing ever happens there. No business gets done there. It's just crap, and how that has changed immensely over the subsequent 20 years between policy and terrorists and things like that. So it's one of the big changes of the last 20 years.
It's big changes. And in healthcare, thinking your 4 years at GE Healthcare, gosh, these days, probably most of our large health systems, 60% of their revenues come from governments. Well, Jeff, we love to get to know our guests and understand them a bit. It kind of leads to how they have been leaders. What was life like growing up for you, Jeff?
My background, Gary, I was a good mix of a athlete. I like sports, and kind of a math geek, right? So I was always liked solving problems. I always enjoyed science and math and all those things. But I also played football, basketball, baseball. I love team sports. And, in some way, shape, or form, my whole life was shaped by those two things that I started very early on. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. My dad worked at GE. So from a very early age, I understood kind of the corporate life. He worked in the aircraft engines business. I always enjoyed seeing the technology and the products. And I would say the last thing is it was really a great, kind of typical middle-class American upbringing. I had great parents. I went to a very good public high school. I had a chance to kind of get a good education. And it's the kind of upbringing that we hope still exists throughout the United States.
Well, what did the young Jeff think about leadership, or did you even think about that in your high school and college years?
Yeah, I'd say a lot of the leadership I had was based on sports. I had good, I'd say, just fundamental basics from my parents of treating people with respect, be accountable, build teams. And so I think I always would tell people as I grew in my career. Careers are shaped on training, experiences, and things you learn at your parents' knee, right? And some of those can't be trained. And I had a good chance early on to learn about, to be curious and persevere and kind of having a good balance of self-confidence and self-awareness. And that really came from my parents as much as anything else. And so I was quite lucky in that regard. But I was, captain of sports teams and president of clubs in college and things like that. And so it was a good, well-rounded background. I never thought about, it's funny, it's the 17-year cicada. And in Cincinnati, that was a big deal. And I remember, I was like in 5th grade and the teacher said, okay, put in a jar what you plan to be doing 17 years from now. I thought, of course, being a professional football player, I had no aspiration to be a business executive of any way. So, but those were the kind of dreams we had.
Well, was there a point that you just kind of realized you were a good leader and that leadership was going to be a key part of your professional life? Was there a point where it just kind of clicked for you and you said, leadership is really, really important for me to participate in?
It's funny, Gary, because you've spent your life training leaders, but it's one of those things that if you think you're a good leader, it means you aren't one. So I think there was a point in my life when I recognized that I was a good peer, that I liked working with people, that I was willing to be accountable for things, that I was willing to help drive change or things like that, and that those elements would help people follow you, right? And whether that was in my 20s or 30s, at some point you kind of recognize that the things you were doing or the way you acted or the way you conducted yourself earned you the right to be a leader, right? So even though I took courses on leadership in school and I went and training at GE on how to be a good leader, you're not really with it until you kind of see it in practice and see whether people follow.
Well, of course, you've written the book Hot Seat, which is 12 chapters of wisdom about leadership, Jeff. Great job there. And I'm sure our viewers, if they haven't come in contact with that book, you should, because it's a must read for anybody who's interested or is a leader. Thinking about taking responsibility for your actions, you shared a story in there about Reggie Williams from your Dartmouth football days. Could you share that with us? I thought that was really a powerful story, Jeff.
A lot of leadership you learn from observation, observing how other people comport themselves. And one of the elements of being a good leader is the willingness to stand apart, willingness to buck the trend. And so when I was in college, the superstar captain of the football team, who was the best football player, maybe the best athlete I'd ever seen, was a guy named Reggie Williams. And Reggie ended up playing 13 years in the NFL, actually for the Cincinnati Bengals. But we were struggling as a team, and he was just so much better than everybody else. He was a little bit above it all. And we're having a team meeting because we had lost 2 games in a row. And Reggie was speaking because he was the team captain. And a guy named Mike Brate, who was a second-string quarterback, stands up and says, Reggie, that's not good enough. We're failing because you aren't being a good leader right now. And I thought Mike was going to get the heck beat out of him or something bad was going to happen. But it was just one of those things that was imprinted on my mind forever because everybody that left the room that day had respect for Mike and his willingness to kind of stand apart, because at the end of the day, he depicted what the issue really was. And so I think that's, like I said, you build your experience base by observing people in your career. And that was the observation of somebody's willingness to stand apart.
So did you go right to Harvard Business School from Dartmouth, or was there some intervening period of time there?
Yeah, no, I worked 2 years. I kind of ran out of money. So I worked 2 years for Procter & Gamble and earned enough money to kind of start my way back to school. And probably the only thing that was distinguishing, Gary, about that time in my life was that my desk mate, my office mate, was Steve Ballmer, who ended up going to be a pretty well-known guy at Microsoft, and we're still good friends. We're still good friends today. But so I worked 2 years, then went to business school, and then I joined GE right after business school.
What caused you to join GE, Jeff?
Gary, I wanted to be an operator. I worked the summer between years of business school at Boston Consulting Group and really loved the experience. But I didn't really want to be a banker, or I didn't want to be a consultant. I really wanted to be an operator. So I thought, clearly at GE had a reputation for good management. I knew I'd learn a lot. I never thought about staying a career there. I thought I'd stay 5 years and see what I learned, what I liked, things like that. And 5 years turned into 35 years, right? So it's just the way careers, couldn't have planned it that way, but I knew it was going to be a good experience. And it certainly turned out to be just that.
What were your kind of main assignments leading up to GE Healthcare?
So I spent most of my career in GE's plastics business. And I did a series of commercial and kind of product management, marketing, sales kind of jobs around the world in GE Plastics. I spent 4 years in our appliance business. And in our appliance business, I ran the service business during a huge product recall that really is what got me, I think, noticed by Jack and by people in the senior leadership team, not because it was good, but because I was dealing with a horrible, kind of product recall. And so I got a lot of attention for all the wrong reasons, but that's frequently the way careers were built. And then I ran our plastics business, and then I had the chance in 1996 to go run the healthcare business. And if you talk to CEOs, many of the CEOs that are friends with today or over the years, and you say, what was your favorite job? None of them will ever say being the CEO. They'll always say it was being a division president, or when I was in China or something like that. And in my case, running the healthcare business was just it was a great job. I liked the business. I learned a lot. It was a good time for my family. It was just a good fit for me personally. And it was, like it always in every era in healthcare, you can say it's a time of great change. And this was another time of great change in healthcare. And so it was really it was an extremely fun experience, let's say.
What was your first thought about healthcare once you went there? Healthcare is kind of a bizarre industry in some ways. What were your first thoughts about healthcare?
So I run our plastics business, which is a hardcore industrial business, right? General Motors and was a customer and things like that. So I got to healthcare in 1996. And like I did my whole career, I would go on field trips and try to understand the business from the market back. And so a couple of impressions, Gary, but the one that really sticks in my mind to this day is how terrible the quality was in healthcare. That there were no metrics, that there was little accountability, I would say. So the best, like if you walk through a Ford assembly line plant, which was a big customer of ours, there were quality metrics all over the place. But in 1996, in healthcare, there were just no metrics about quality and variance and things like that. And I remember, Gary, one of the very first meetings I had was we had cath lab tube, X-ray tube that would burst and like oil would leak on patients. And I'm sitting at this meeting saying, you got to be shitting me. We can't possibly sell a product that does this. I was freaked out because like in my hardcore, dirty, nitty gritty plastics business, we would never have anything like that. Right. So that was my first impression. My second impression was just how much I loved doctors, right? How much I loved learning and talking and understanding them and asking them and be curious about them. And it's one of those things, even to this day in the healthcare world, we still forget about doctors, right? There's every plan and every company and every new theory and every new this, that, or the other thing. We forget that the people that help patients, that spend money, that save money, that drive quality are really the physicians. So I'd say those two things. One was just how behind healthcare was to every other industry I'd been in. And the other one was kind of like the star of the show, how important they were, how much I learned from them and loved them and just enjoyed that experience. I could give you 100 more, but I'll stop with those two.
Following your 4 years there, then you were selected for this, I would call it almost like a bake-off, with you and Jim McNerney and Robert Nardelli. That must have been an odd situation for you, Jeff. Looking at it from the outside, it was like, wow, never seen anything quite like that before. What was that like for you to go through all that?
I think for every succession process, the process is part of the process, right? In other words, you're going to step into a job with a lot of pressure. If you can't withstand the pressure of the succession process, you're probably not going to, it's like running for president. If you're not a good candidate, it's unlikely you're going to be a really great president, right? So, and it was all that pressure. It was a totally unique time, Gary. Young people today wouldn't understand it, but kind of 1999, 2000, it was 20 years, almost 20 years until the NASDAQ was at the same level it was in 1999, right? So you had this incredibly inflated, and Jack Welch was just the most famous business executive of that era. He was like, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk all rolled into one. So it was very public. It was very intense. It was really difficult, I would say. I didn't enjoy it at all. It was just of the time, is the way I would describe it. So I trusted Jack. I trusted the company, but as a process, it was challenging.
Was he a mentor looking back on it? I mean, he didn't seem to be a warm and fuzzy person from what I remember of him, but was he a mentor to you, Jeff?
I don't think he was a mentor to anybody really. Just, he was so, he was just so separate from all of us in terms of, notoriety and skill and all that stuff. But he was a good teacher, right? You learn from observation. You learn from proximity, from watching him in good times and bad, and that's what made Jack, I think, really tick. But he wasn't the kind of guy that would call you in his office and spend an hour just chatting about what you were doing, right or wrong or indifferent, or spend a weekend with you or something like that. That just wasn't Jack. I talk a lot about one of his skill sets was his ability to run things at size. And one of the things that made him so successful is he had a voice for 300,000 people. He had a voice for one person. He knew the audience in an immensely different ways. And I remember he was in Milwaukee where the healthcare business was headquartered. He just chewed my butt out for like an hour. We had to go meet with the union leadership. We walked like 20 feet down the hall, and we walk in to meet with the union leadership, and he's charming, he's telling jokes, and then we go back to the room and he starts in on me again. And I say, where was the guy I saw like 5 minutes ago? He says, you're in trouble, they're not, and he was just that kind of guy. Not to meaning to tell too many stories, Gary, but I took, there were a group of sisters that ran the Catholic healthcare systems in 1999, and I took them to have breakfast with Welch in Fairfield. There may be a dozen of them. And it was one of the most fascinating, experiences I ever remember, because, like one of the sisters would say, well, Mr. Welch, we don't think making money is that important, so we never want to fire people. And Jack looks at him and says, sister, how do you know who's good? And it was just like this great, but he was listening and engaging, and those are some of the things I remember the most about how fun it was to work with him.
He'd been there as a CEO for 20 years. He was just prominent as all get out at that time, maybe the most visible CEO in the business. Did you ever worry about, gosh, how do you follow somebody like that?
Oh, sure. In other words, I think if you thought that the task was really following him, quote unquote, nobody would do the job. But the world changes so dramatically, and in this case, the difference between, let's say, 1999 and 2005 was hugely different, right? It's, 9/11 happened, you had China emerging, you had new technologies disrupting, you just go down the list. And I think what happens in business, but maybe in every field, is, life just changes. It changes rapidly, and companies have to respond. And so you can't look backwards on leadership. And, it's just, so you can't think about the role of replacing him in the time he did it and the job he did. You have to think about it in terms of what's next, what do we need to be ready for, and there was a lot of change, really an immense amount of change.
Yeah, well, speaking of change, the world changed, of course, with 9/11, which happened a day or two after you became CEO. Gosh, what a shock to your system. What was your first thought when you saw the planes hitting the building?
Yeah, look, it was, I was in Seattle, Washington, and I was downstairs in the fitness center on a stair stepper watching TV. And when I first got down there, the first plane had hit, and while I'm exercising, the second plane came in, and you knew life was different, right? And I think my first thought was really safety of our people. Was anybody impacted? We had a lot of NBC and GE Capital people in New York City. Kind of who was safe, and then over the next 24 or 48 hours, kind of slowly beginning to think about. We were in the commercial aviation business. That was going to be hard hit. We were in the insurance business. That was going to be hard hit. We're in the media business. We went a week with no commercials. That was going to be hard hit. So I'd say as the first 24 hours and the shock went past, you start thinking about the business impact, and that was profound, right? So that's kind of, you go through your family, your team, your people, and then how do you start reacting from a business standpoint?
What was the process that you set up, Jeff, just to consider the impact of all of this on GE?
Yeah, so probably I was still in Seattle, so this was a Tuesday. By Thursday, we had impromptu business reviews with all of our businesses. So I asked all of our business leaders, I said, don't prepare a lot of charts, maybe one or two charts, but just give me a snapshot about what still works, what doesn't work, what are you thinking about, and clearly that identified the big issue to be commercial aviation. And so probably by the second week, Gary, we honed in on the 2 or 3 areas that were really going to be the most dramatic, impact of what we had to deal with, and a lot of that was in the aviation sector. So then we started. Kind of every other day, we would have calls at the end of the day to go through who did we have to lend money to, which airlines were in the most trouble, those kinds of things. And so it's, for probably 30 days or 60 days, you're with, pretty intense crisis communication. You learn a lot. You learn a lot about your team and your people during that time period, right? You sit there, like some people come in and say, oh, you own 1,200 aircraft. That was so stupid. You get those people out of the room. You say, okay, look, you just take a 2-week vacation because you're not going to be helpful on this. You need people. I say, like in a crisis, if you drive home one night and there's smoke coming out of your home, everybody in the neighborhood is going to help you put the fire out, right? If you come home and see smoke and cry out arson, nobody's going to help, right? And so you see some people are yelling fire, some people are yelling arson. You want the people that are there kind of willing to solve the problems. And that becomes apparent.
Any surprises as you think about it? People that you thought were all stars that just couldn't deal with the crisis?
Yeah, in both ways, in both ways. Yeah, I'd say on the one hand, you had people that were really taking action, were right up front, and were completely team-oriented and willing to face into the tough challenges. Dave Calhoun, that runs Boeing now, he was running our aircraft engines business then. He was just a superb leader, faced right into it. And then you have some people that are not transparent or not willing to kind of help other people in the process, and those people become obvious at the same time, right? Or use this opportunity to play politics of one kind or another. So you see people on both sides of the ledger on that. And again, you never know much about people in good days, but you know a lot about them in bad days. And so you got to keep your eyes up because you're going to figure out who the stars really are when the chips are down.
7 or 8 years after that, then of course we had the Great Recession. But before we get to that, so during this 7 or 8 year period of time, what were the major changes on GE? What were the major changes that you felt you had to make just in reaction to 9/11, Jeff?
Yeah, not so much, Gary, in reaction to 9/11, but just, the company had a hugely vibrant financial service enterprise that had been built over 10 or 20 years and had kind of a tired set of industrial businesses that had been underinvested in. And so it was pretty clear to everybody that we had to go about investing much more in our technology, in our globalization, in our customer franchise, particularly around the industrial sets of businesses. So we did a lot of portfolio work. We made some big investments in healthcare. We got into life sciences. We got into renewable energy. We doubled the investment in our aviation business. And those were the main changes that, I think the board was very supportive, knew we had to make. And, GE was a big, complicated company, Gary. So our investors, we traded like Amazon, right, in the year 2001, despite the fact that investors didn't really know or, let's say, understand all they could have or should have about the company. And so, driving that kind of change was challenging because you'd sit there and say, we bought a company in 2004 called Amersham, which was a life sciences company. We paid 17 times EBITDA, right? And investors trashed me because they said, gosh, you guys used to pay 8 times EBITDA. But I said, that was for an insurance company, right? It was that's for a financial service business, not a high-tech, high-margin life science business. And, so we had to struggle with helping people understand the nature of the company and really trying to reinvest in the technology that we thought was going to be relevant for the 21st century.
Well, then along came the Great Recession, which caused another major shock, and that led to some strategies, including divestitures. How were you thinking about the size of GE, and what were your kind of reactions to the Great Recession?
9/11 was a tail risk event, but it impacted everybody, right? COVID was a tail risk event. It impacted everybody. The financial crisis was very specific, right? It hurt financial service industry very hard. It hurt, kind of what's called wholesale funded finance companies like GE Capital was a direct hit. So we took really a direct hit to our business model in 2008 and 9. And look, we had to kind of fix it on our own. We benefited like everybody did from government programs, and they were great. But banks had deposits. If you had deposits, you came through the financial crisis, in better shape, right? We relied on healthy debt markets, and they took a long time to heal. So both, I would say, the investor perspective on financial services changed dramatically. The way the government looked at financial services changed dramatically, and just the ability to fund growth in GE Capital changed dramatically. So we did the best we could over, kind of a couple years, but by 2015, it became apparent that we really just couldn't sustain a good, healthy business and financial services. And so we decided to divest most of those businesses, at least the businesses that weren't directly connected to GE equipment, GE assets. And we made that decision in 2015. It was done very carefully and done with lots of interaction with our board and investors, but that was a very tough decision to make. And we made that over a couple of years.
And then NBC was another divestiture that you made, some little bit after that, was it?
We did that in 2010 and 2011.
Oh,
and
I got
again,
it. Okay.
It was it was clearly something that never really fit with the company. It was a good business, and we ran it well for most of our time. But, people like me, we could go into any business review around the company and add value. By the time I retired, I knew a lot about the energy sector and the healthcare sector and financial services and things like that. I never could walk into an NBC meeting and say, hey, let's punch up the script a little bit, or, King Kong doesn't look like a good movie to me, but this movie does. So it just was never a hugely direct fit with the company. And so we sold it, kind of, as we were going through the financial crisis, we basically had to bolster the GE Capital balance sheet. And one of the ways to bolster the balance sheet was to take capital from NBC and really stick it into our financial services to preserve that. So we could have picked a better time to sell it, but at the end of the day, nobody really thought twice about whether or not it was the right thing to do.
Did you ever think about divesting healthcare at any point along the line?
A number of times bankers would come in and suggest it, but I would always say, look, GE been in the healthcare business for 100 years, so since 1915. We had a hugely respected brand. The business had grown from $3 billion in 1996 to $21 billion by 2016, so we were building the franchise out. It was a very, I would say, harmonious business to what the rest of the company was doing. We always felt like it helped bolster the investability of the company and the luster, let's say, that or the price earnings ratio that investors will look at it. So for a number of reasons, we always felt like it was a good fit. In many ways, I tried to make it bigger while I was there because I thought it was a good fit. But again, it's always when you're in a conglomerate, the burden is on you to say, why does it fit versus why wouldn't it fit? But I think, look, if life's long. If you think about building companies for the long term, if you're in one of the biggest, one of the fastest growth, one of the, an industry that rewards scale, if you can answer all those questions, and that's called healthcare, man, you exited at your own peril. Really, you can only play that card once, and I always felt like you were crazy to do that. I teach a little bit now, Gary, and I tell my students in 1982 when I graduated from business school, if you would have decided to build your career in healthcare, you would have been a success, no matter what you did. You could have gone to work for a system or an insurer or in a device company. I think the same thing's true today. So you think about your career, you can also think about it as a company. If you have a great position in an industry that's growing, man, you should just add to it and build on it and things like that. And that's the way I always looked at healthcare.
Jeff, you mentioned the board of directors, and you had the board, you had to manage through September 11th, you had to manage through the Great Recession with the board. Any lessons that you took away from how you deal with the board during these sorts of crises?
I'm now out of it. I'm on boards now. I never was when I was at GE. There's this sense that they're all knowing and all seeing. And I would say for the vast majority of my time as CEO, I had really a great board and great board members. But they also can be part of the problem sometimes. They have their own egos and their own agendas, and getting that all aligned is also a challenge. I think you have to imagine your board on the worst day, not the best day. So I think about my board in February of 2009. We were getting crushed in the market. It was the middle of recession. My board was awesome. They were awesome, right? Ralph Larson was our presiding director. He made me cut the dividend. I didn't want to. I had 1,000 excuses not to. He just turned to me and said, we're going to do it. We're going to do it now. I loved him for it. That was exactly what was needed at that moment in time. But sometimes, they can also get lost, right? And one of the things we struggle with, Gary, over time, and again, I blame myself, I don't blame any of them, is because of the nature of our financial service business, we let the board balloon to 18 people. That's just too big, and anytime you just have a board of that size, you kind of lose your connectivity and your focus, and that's what happened to us. And again, that one was on me. So I think I guess one piece of advice I'd give to any CEO is imagine your board on the worst day, the very worst day, and go around the table and say, on that bad day, is this board member, are they going to be about the company, about me, or are they going to be about themselves, right? And answer that question for each one of them, because I guarantee it's a mixed bag. It is never unilateral. And the best you can, get all the ones that are in it for themselves, get them out of town, because they can do damage.
Yeah, for sure. What's the right size board, do you think?
Look, I'd say 10, 12 max, but I would say better 10. And, I think it's always good to have diversity of all kinds of thought, of gender, of race, of all kinds, perspectives. I'd say that's more important than even, having everybody that knows healthcare, right? It's always good to have diversity and judgment, but at the end of the day, it's trust. It's really trust. If you're making your numbers and things are good, board meetings are a lot of fun, right? If you're not making your numbers, or you're in the middle of a storm like 9/11, the financial crisis, they are no fun. And there's times when I'd say boards want authority without responsibility. And a lot of governance pushes that way. And I think that's not healthy. That's how companies can get in trouble.
I agree with that. I mean, as a CEO, there's a lot of criticism for CEOs that are quote unquote managing the board. But on the other hand, this point about authority, responsibility, getting that blend right, I think the CEO has to be active in managing the board, doesn't it? How do you view that?
Gary, I always believed in access. Like I always said to the board members, so we insisted that they each one visit 2 businesses a year without me there, right? So we would organize trips of 4 directors, and they would go to healthcare, or they would go to China or aviation or things like that. But beyond that, I say, Gary, look, anytime you want to go any place and see anything, you go, okay? But if you give them access and you say you've got the run of the place, okay, all you need to do is schedule with the HR leader or somebody like that, or the general counsel, but you go, give them access, give them transparency, and then they come back and say, well, we think your aircraft engine strategy is stupid. I'd say you've seen it 10 times, right? Over 5 years. If you've seen it 10 times over 5 years, you own it, right? You don't get a chance to do another like Roman vote, like one more time. Like it's just, and so I think as a CEO, you should give them, and I think a lot of CEOs don't give enough access. My advice to everybody is give infinite access, but don't let them flip-flop all the time. Don't let people say, well, if you've tried a bunch of things and it just didn't work, they have to say, look, it's on me too. I saw it, I supported it, it didn't work. Okay, that's on all of us.
Jeff, let's turn to Crotonville for a minute. You were a big proponent of Crotonville, and how did you view Crotonville, and what was your thought as you kind of put resources into Crotonville over time?
Crotonville was built in 1956. I'd say if it didn't exist in the format I had, I probably wouldn't have done it, but the fact that it was in existence made it easy to plug into. So that, number one. Number two, I think it's always incumbent anytime you're trying to teach leadership to stay up to date. So, basically, depending on what theory you have or how you're trying to drive change, it kind of has a 5-year life or 7-year life or 3-year life. So we needed to keep fresh thinking involved in everything we do. So we try to keep, professors in residence, other CEOs that would come, just like everything we could do. And then Gary, I try to get it filled 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So with either GE people or customers, or we used to do work with the fire department in New York City. I felt like it was such an asset. It was such an opportunity that shame on us if we were precious with it. So I wanted it to be used every day of the week, every week of the year. So that's the way kind of I felt about it. Was I didn't want it to be a luxury. I didn't want it to be perceived as, I wanted it to be a working person's institute. And so we tried to keep it fresh. We tried to keep it filled. We tried to use it to help sell things. And we always were, kind of you and I, we started off this conversation with what healthcare looked like in 1996. But, I'd say a lot of the systems have made tremendous progress over the last 25 years and picked up things like lean management or digitization or training of leaders and things like that. So we got a lot of mileage out of it in the healthcare industry because a lot of the best CEOs really believed in self-help, wanted to get better, wanted to learn, and we used it to our advantage.
today social cultural issues like the environment, diversity, and so on are kind of hot topics, if you will. They were not really when you were there, and yet you were a proponent for both of those. How did you think about the social cultural issues, Jeff?
Yeah, it's much harder today, Gary, than ever before. It's a more complicated leadership job. I think a lot of it is just the time we live in, but there's a context that I think people don't get much satisfaction from political leaders today. There's more pressure on business leaders to be involved and to have a point of view, and that's even changed more dramatically since I've been retired. I think it's a real aspect of just respecting people and having the ability to drive culture and change, right? And so this notion of really having a sense that women or African Americans or global talent or however you wanted to play it, LGBTQ, I was very hands-on with that. I was very numbers oriented in terms of wanting to see people get promoted and things like that. So that's an aspect that I think just is consistent with wanting to be well managed and wanting to have great people. And then there's areas like the environment and areas like the capability of technology to drive change and climate change and things like that. That's more complicated. It requires policy, it requires innovation, it requires investment. But we could see, probably as a company as early as 2005, we declared that we thought climate change was real and caused by man and could be existential, and we always invested accordingly. So I think as a leader, you got to think about a couple of things. You got to think about, what do you believe in? What's the values and the culture of your company? What's your track record, right? In other words, if you want to come out and say, we think the voting law in Georgia is wrong, but yet your own track record with diversity in African Americans is terrible, you can still say it, but nobody listens to you, right? So you have to understand at that point, you're just flapping your lips. You're not really, nobody cares. I think you got to make it long term, right? So I was watching the news this morning. Texas is the next state that's going to change a voting law. So all the people in Georgia, you got to be willing to declare in Texas, right? Or Arizona or whatever state's next. You've got to think long term, and you got to make it personal. I always, Gary, I signed petitions and I was a member of the business council and all that stuff. But when something was really important to me, I used my own voice, right? I didn't just sign a petition. I didn't join 300 other people. I would send my own tweet, or I would give my own speech, or I would do something individually, because unless you're willing to put your own specific name on something, people don't take it seriously. So I think you got to be thoughtful about all these activities, all these things that are going on, but there's no doubt that people expect business leaders or hospital CEOs. It's a public job now, and your voice is expected, and you better be thoughtful about it.
Let me ask one final question, if I could, and you've kind of already just in the last several minutes answered this, but a fair number of our audience are young up-and-coming leaders. I'm sure you are approached all the time by these young people and asked for your advice, but what advice would you give a young up-and-coming leader?
Gary, if I would look at the book itself, which is kind of just the stories of my career, it doesn't try to lecture, it just kind of tells the story. I'd say a couple things are going to be important as you go forward. One is, you've got to understand disruption. You've got to understand technology. You got to pick what's next, right? And that's because we live in a time of relentless change, and so you have to have your own point of view on what's going to happen next. So that's key. You got to be willing to make decisions, right? And frequently you make decisions with imperfect information. You're going to be criticized. You're going to be judged, but you have to have the ability to make decisions. You have to connect with people, right? You need to make leadership personal. You've got to be willing to connect and build teams and build trust. And you have to understand that sometimes people you don't trust, who you leave in their jobs, they're going to break your heart. And so I think you can see that. You got to be a problem solver. You got to solve problems you created, right? It's always easy to solve other people's problems, but you have to solve problems that you created, and that's really hard. And then lastly, I just think, Gary, you got to take a punch, right? I tell the last day of class in my business school class, I always say to my students, a good career answers 3 questions, right? One is how fast you can learn. I had the chance to get smarter every day. Some days I didn't get smarter. That was on me, but I had the chance to get smarter every day, right? How fast can you learn? How much can you give, right? What are you willing to give to others? What are you willing to kind of do for others? What are you willing to kind of commit to make the world a better place? And then how much can you take? Can you work hard? Can you be criticized? Can you fail and dust yourself off and get up again and keep trying? And if you can learn, if you can give, if you can take a punch, you're going to find your own way in this life. And people tend to give up too soon. And so I would tell all those things to people that are watching your great podcast and Lessons for Leaders.
Jeff, thanks so much. Get the book, Hot Seat. It's a good one. We've got a lot of respect for you and what you've done in your career, Jeff, and look forward to continuing to interact with you. Thanks for being here.
Nice talking to you.